Hello there gamers, it's me Frosty. Horror games are typically scary, and one of the pinnacles of horror in video games is Capcom's icon Resident Evil. Being one of gaming's oldest and most lucrative horror franchises, Resident Evil has seen many variants, some good, some bad, and some that let you punch boulders. The horror in Resident Evil has really evolved, from humble beginnings with limited cameras, to today where we want the tall vampire lady to find us and kill us. So today, let's examine the evolution of the horror and gameplay in the Resident Evil series, from its humble beginnings to the recent release of Resident Evil Village. But first, if you aren't subscribed, maybe you should think about doing that. Also, I stream on Twitch now. Yeah, that's it. The link's in the description. The first in the long-running franchise, Resident Evil brought with it the foundation of the universe we know today. As far as the ever Resident Evil games go, I would say the first one is one of the least scary, but most tense. Due to the limited technology of the time, the first Resident Evil has a stationary camera, making traversal around the mansion that the player is stuck in a challenge to say the least. Players also face the issue of limited resources, and limited resources has really become a staple of the Resident Evil series. Conserving your ammo in this game is pretty hard when you shoot at literally everything that moves. Have I mentioned that I hate horror games? But if you don't conserve, you'll definitely die later on. So do it. The horror of the Resident Evil series got its basis in the premiere title, with the tense moments becoming a trademark of a franchise that was greatly expanded in the next game. Resident Evil 2 teaches us two things. Leon S. Kennedy is a king, and that when people are chasing you, it's scary. In the first title, players didn't have to worry about being chased down and massacred by a shadowy foe. Well, that was about to change in Resident Evil 2. While Mr. X's chasing is very limited in this game, it's still frightening to turn a corner for the behemoth to be waiting, ready to attack. Did I mention that I hate horror games? Resident Evil 2 also expanded the stationary camera, and made it somewhat usable. Even though it wasn't ideal, it was beginning to become the main aesthetic of the Resident Evil series. One other unique addition was the zapping system, which would show the game's events from Leon and Claire Redfield's perspectives, as the story would swap between the two as they tried to escape Raccoon City. Resident Evil 2 was one of the most successful PlayStation games in the 90s, and it really was a staple of horror for that generation. While being almost identical in gameplay to Resident Evil 2, Nemesis furthered the stalking enemies like Mr. X into a genuine staple of the franchise. Nemesis' fear-inducing stalking of the player, plus the limited camera, made Resident Evil 3 one of the scariest early entries, and while it doesn't differ too much from Resident Evil 2, the addition of enemies like Nemesis truly advanced the series in a great way. Resident Evil 4 is one of gaming's most influential titles, and it's not even for the horror. Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder action gameplay revolutionized how shooters looked, and its aesthetic has become a standard for many linear and open-world shooters with a heavy focus on exploration or survival. Another big addition was a movable camera, but since this game came out in 2005, those were pretty common by now. Resident Evil 4 is heralded as one of the best games of all time, but it also led to the horror of Resident Evil being sidelined for more action-oriented experiences, which really became a focal point of the next two games in the series. This game is definitely not a horror game. The positive response to the shooting and action in Resident Evil 4 led to the following games taking a more action-oriented approach. The game didn't really add much besides an increase in action, but it also was the first video game to use the motion capture technology developed for the film Avatar, which is now pretty common practice for big titles. While Resident Evil 5 lacked the scares of past titles, it's a fantastic action game, but it was also very divisive to fans and critics who wanted more horror than action in this title. Resident Evil 6 was a culmination of the past games into a lackluster action horror experience. With multiple storylines like Resident Evil 2 and action like Resident Evil 5, this entry was seen as a culmination of the Resident Evil franchise and almost like a finale to the series. Resident Evil 5 was really a bland game. It was more of a greatest hits of gameplay and horror elements of the Resident Evil series, and it left players wanting the traditional Resident Evil and not this weird action-oriented, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't good. And sadly, for a long time, players thought this was the end of the Resident Evil franchise. Until... yeah, Resident Evil came back, and this time, we were the protagonist. Biohazard introduced a first-person camera that brought the horror right to our eyes. Have I mentioned how much I hate horror games? Along with the first-person camera, Resident Evil 7 switched its focus to more exploration and horror than action-packed gunfights, and it really helped revitalize the series and make this game stand out. Biohazard also gave us the beginning to a new story following Ethan Winters that was much easier to follow than past games, which seemed to hop around the Resident Evil universe and make little sense. Biohazard did great things for the Resident Evil brand and really gave new trajectory to the franchise. Resident Evil Village is the true culmination of the horror and action needed to make a good Resident Evil game. With a great and gripping story and awesome bad guys, Village is a fantastic game, and while being very similar to Biohazard, builds on the style with a new setting and great addition to the universe's lore. Also, with Resident Evil Village, we were given Lady Dimitrescu. Thank you, Capcom. But that's it for a brief look at the evolution of the hit horror franchise Resident Evil. And as time went on, it's clear to see how the games evolved, from limited tense horror experiences to action-packed shooters, and then back to tense horror with a less limiting camera. As much as I've mentioned that I hate horror games, I think there's a lot of great titles in the Resident Evil series that are almost required for gamers to play if they want their gamer card, or else I will revoke it personally. And even if these games make you pee your pants, I'd say it's worth it when we get to stare at the hot, tall vampire lady. It's not weird. You're the one making it weird. Okay, maybe it's a little weird.